trying to figure out ways to keep myself off of social media because that's just been stressing me out. It's not great for my anxiety disorder. And also been trying to figure out a way to give you guys something that you might find valuable. So I've had a couple of people suggest that they would love to see what my process is as I'm hand lettering something. So I thought I would go ahead and show you what that process looks like with a specific design that I thought that I had completed something like 8 years ago, something like that, but I've learned so much in that time that I want to revisit it and redo it. You can start on paper with pencil or ink, whatever you like. I have been working pretty much exclusively on my iPad for a while as far as beginning projects like this. So I am working in Procreate, and I'm going to go ahead and start a new canvas. And I'll tell you a little bit about like what I'm doing in Procreate as well, but I want this to at least start out as less of a program tutorial and more of the basics of the art form of hand lettering and calligraphy and illustration and that sort of thing. So I typically work at the 11 by 14 at 300 dpi size. 300 dpi is the resolution. It's 300 dots per inch. That's what that stands for. And I'm gonna switch my canvas to be horizontal. So the more dots per inch you have, the higher the clarity of your photo is going to be, or your artwork is going to be. It is the typical resolution for print work. So as you can see, I'm importing photos. I've been organizing everything on my iPad, so it's a lot easier to market from here and a lot easier to have my portfolio stuff together from here. But I am choosing this Keep Breathing design as what I'm starting with. So it's already at a pretty good size, so I'm going to keep it as is. A couple things that I'm going to do with it. First, I'm going to name my layer. So this is the original artwork. And then I'm also going to lock this layer. Well, before I do that, I'm going to drop the opacity way, way down. Why am I doing that? This would be like sort of similar to if you were using a light box. I want to be able to see what my original work was because I think it's a good base. I don't want it to be full opacity and therefore compete with the other stuff that I'm doing. So one last thing here, I'm going to unlock and change this to multiply. What the easiest way to explain this is multiply is going to make sure that anything below that layer, the white isn't going to show up. So the next thing that I do with pieces like this is I use a dot grid. So I'm going to go up to where I have such things. So I have guides here, and I already have my dot grid selected. I have black selected, and that's fine. That's a little big for what I want to do. So over here is the size of my brush, and I'm going to drop that down to about 60 and see what that does. Oh, that's so much better. All right. So when I sketch, not on the computer or not on my iPad, I like to use a dot grid. It's a lot less of an issue for me than working with typical gridded paper. It's not as rigid. It gives me that structure that I need without being so rigid that I can't really work with it. So I'm also dropping the opacity of this down so that it's not too distracting. Let me bring it up just a little bit though, because I'm not sure how this will translate in the video here. So I'm going to name this my grid, and I'm also going to lock this. I have grabbed those two and put them in a group, and I'll rename the group, let's just say starting point. All right, now I'm actually ready to start working on this. So I kind of like how this kind of naturally worked. Although let me adjust just a little bit because I want my baseline to be on one of these horizontal lines of the grid. So I'm going to unlock that, unlock this, and maybe I'll just pull this up slightly, and that works fine for me. Another thing that I've done with Procreate is I've created some of my own brushes. Procreate comes with a lot of really fantastic brushes as it is, but I like to customize mine because I really like it to feel more like I'm working on paper. So I have a soft sketch brush that I have edited from one of their typical brushes. Let me do one more thing here. I'm going to unlock this and move this over. The reason I'm moving this over now, if you take a look, while the overall design is centered, we have the end of the lettering there, and while this swash does come out, the beginning of the lettering is there, so it's not really centered, and that's kind of not what I want as I'm working with it. So I'm going to grab and make sure I'm keeping my baseline about where I want it, and looking at the space between the G and the edge of the grid and the beginning of the K and the edge of the grid. Now I'm okay with it if it's just a little bit not symmetrical, because balance is more important than symmetry in situations like this. So I think I'm pretty happy with that. I'll go ahead and relock it and close that point down. So I'm going to rename this sketch. I like to name my layers. I say that I'm not turning this into a program tutorial, but sorry. I like to rename my layers so that I know what is what. And it just kind of helps me keep things organized in my brain and not have to worry about where something is if I have to move it around. All right, so now we're going to get into the actually starting the sketching everything out. Now, if you're starting on a new piece, you're not going to have this outline that I already have. So I guess this is a little bit of a disadvantage for you as far as starting out. But I'd encourage you to take a look at a lot of the styles that you might be trying to emulate. Take a look at calligraphy. Take a look at really good cursive handwriting. Look at how the letters are formed. Look at how things can be connected together. Do a lot of sketches before you get to this point. So I might do another tutorial down the road with a new design where I'm not reworking one that already exists, but this is just kind of where we are. So the reason I want to rework this, we have this sort of shape here, right? It's a nice, open, kind of rounded shape. But then we come over here to the same sort of thing on our B, and it's a lot more oblong, it's more squished, and that matches more what we have going on with our H here. So I have the option of working with my K and making it the same sort of thing, but as I'm looking throughout the whole design, there's just a lot that I do want to change. So take a look at the A and the G here. You can see while they're rounded, they're a little kind of an odd shape here. It's not an unusual shape if you are working with calligraphy, but my goal with this was to make it look more like handwriting, like really, really, really nice handwriting than specifically calligraphy. So, and those shapes there where they're a little more kind of squared off at the top don't work well with how I have the round part of my N or H or even my E's and B here. They just aren't working out the same. So that's the sort of thing I want to rework everything so that it works together. So I'm going to clear this. and go ahead and start with my actual sketch. I'm gonna need to unlock this so I can turn the opacity down just a little bit, because when I'm starting with my sketch, let's go to 8%. When I'm starting with my sketch, it can be really hard to see at first. All right. So there's a few things I'm going to be keeping in mind. First of all, keeping in mind the baseline here. So when you are working on lettering, there's a few terms that you need to know. I'm not going to go like all into everything, but so we have our baseline, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's where all of these letters kind of rest. So I want to keep my baseline consistent. There are times where you don't want to, but this piece does not apply to those times. And I want to make my mean the same as well. A mean is what is often called the X height as well. Mean is the line where your lowercase letters kind of keep the top of what they're doing there. So X height is a really interesting way to think of that, because it's literally the height of your lowercase letter x. So, and we also have a descender line and an ascender line. So those are going to be variable here, because if I take a look, the descender is all of those letters that appear beneath your baseline. So think about your P's, your J's, your G's, that sort of thing. So we have the descender of my P there, but the descender of the G is all the way down here. And the ascender, which is anything that appears above that middle line, that mean line, in your lowercase letters like your B's, D's, K's, etc. Those are a bit variable as well. That's not necessarily a problem. I want to be quite clear about that here with this type of thing, because we're not just writing consistent letters. We want there to be consistency throughout, but we don't want everything to be identical. We want it to feel fluid, and we want it to feel really kind of professionally organic, if that makes sense. But I'm not going to be putting in an ascender line and a descender line, because that's just not what I need right now. But I'm going to keep these two lines here the way they are. I'm going to pull my opacity down here so it's a lot more, there we go. So it's a lot more like pencil, because the more I color, it's going to act kind of like a pencil. And I'm going to pull this up just a bit. All right, so keeping in mind my baseline and my X height, and I also want to keep in mind the incline here, the slant of what's going on. So we want the incline everywhere to match. And in Procreate, that's something that I can kind of fix later, but it's not something you are going to be able to fix if you're working on paper. So what I would recommend, as you've done some of your sketches, determine what you want that slant to be, and then just kind of repeat it very softly every so often, like every centimeter, every half inch, whatever makes the most sense for you, so you can make sure that you're keeping that line consistent. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start here. Zooming way in. That's another thing that I have the privilege of being able to do that perhaps you do not. But it's okay to take really light strokes here. So one thing I'm going to do right now, I'm not going to complete that swash here. We call it a swash when it's not part of what the normal letter is typically. So So I'm not going to complete that normal swash. I want to get the rest of my lettering kind of consistent. So there's a couple ways that I can do my K here. This is where taking a look at other calligraphy or other different types of fonts, other handwriting, doing your research here can come in handy. Because since this is based on cursive, that's why I went with this version of a K. But I could also, I'm going to go through and erase part of this here. Make my eraser a little bigger. Because I can also change this up a little bit. So maybe I want that to come up, and we'd have this come down in a different sort of way. Not entirely sure. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to just keep that top bit so it looks more like a sort of traditional K, and pulling that down, but I'm not really paying attention. I'm not planning on where it's going to connect, because maybe I want it to still connect to that R over here in breathing, but maybe I don't. I don't know yet. So continuing on, I'm going to move to my E here. Now I think I'm going to be going with the more rounded letters. For one thing, that is something that I personally find to be more attractive. And for another, most of my letters here are that kind of more rounded form. So one thing that I wasn't particularly pleased with both of these E's is how far down that junction is. The junction would be where the strokes of your letters overlap. So I have a couple of options. The option that I tend to go with a lot nowadays is just having that curve up just a little bit at the end. I feel like that makes it feel kind of friendly, kind of nice in that sort of way. And if I do this and still keep that shape here, then I could have it go up and then intersect there. Not sure if I want to do that, so I'm gonna go back here, but I'm gonna kind of just go through and leave it about here, and then I am going to do the same thing here. Now, since I'm working digitally, I could very easily just copy the first E that I made and paste it beside it, so I could make sure they are the exact same, but that's not really what we want to do when we work with hand lettering, right? When we're doing something hand-drawn like this, we usually want it to feel hand-drawn. We want to kind of look for those clues that, hey, this isn't something that someone just typed up somewhere. This is something that someone put thought into. And while there's a lot of similarities between these two shapes and these two letters, that's not 100% of what's going on. All right, so I have my basic shapes of my E's there. So we're coming across another instance where there's some discrepancy in the original design. So we have a lot of where the left side of the round part of the P is kind of flattened to fit within that line shape, and I really don't want that. So I'm going to start here because I want to make something that feels a little more organic and a little less flat. So remember when I told you to make sure that you have those lines that you're going to be keeping everything kind of similar, keeping the slant sort of the same. This is more of what I'm talking about. We want the peak of our rounded letters and the bottommost section of that roundness to be the same angle. And if you can see here, it's super not the same angle. So I'm gonna kind of go in and fix that up a little bit. So if this is where that is, then we would want, let's pull this over a little more. While if we were working on something that's more graphic design, like I would tell my students to do their sketches in pen, so they have to reiterate. But that's not, like at this stage, once you are at this stage where you are starting to really lay out your work, that's not necessary. Like you want to be working on the same thing because you already have your skeleton down. So we have that. And it's handy too that we have this stem of our P to work from. So I'm gonna pull that up so I can see. And so we want the peak of the bowl of our P to be there. I'm going to pull it down. And one of the big things with lettering as well is you want to take a look at how everything is spaced out. So as you can see here, each side is pretty equal. That's what we want with this. We want it to be balanced. So when you are lettering, you want to take a look at not just the lines that you're drawing, but you want to look at the spaces around those lines. You want to make sure that things feel particularly okay. So I have an idea for this P, but I want to kind of keep going a little bit. I am going to round this out ever so slightly, because we have something that I like to call technical symmetry or technical balance versus visual balance. Technical would be kind of what I showed you where, hey, look, these sides are exactly the same. We have a mirror image there. But then with visual balance, because we have so much of this oval touching the stem of our P, it kind of biases it and makes it feel more heavy that way. So I'm trying to sort of counterbalance that over here ever so slightly. All right, we have a skeleton-ish of our first word done here. So I'm going to move on to breathing. So another benefit that I have that if you're working on paper you won't necessarily have is I don't have to worry too much about my spacing right now, because I can move these letters and respace them later. That's something that you would want to address in your sketches, and that's something where if you were at this stage while drawing, you want to make sure that you're using a really, really light hand so that if you notice that there is some imbalance somewhere, you can erase and redraw, which I would recommend not erasing entirely, just erasing a little bit so you can see the original form that you were happy with looked like, and just copy it over, move it over, after which you could then erase. Okay, so I'm reasonably happy with that B for now. I'm going to move on to my R. Now, I work with R's a little bit differently, particularly when I am working with something that mimics cursive handwriting. So if you remember, if you took cursive in school, you remember that, you know, your typical cursive R is something like this, I believe. And, you know, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But I like to make mine a little fancy. So I'll pull that little part up here, and a lot of times I'll make it a loop. And I will likely keep that being a loop here, since there's going to be so many flourishes and loops everywhere. So I'm pulling that around as a loop, And then I'm pulling the other part of the R below my mean line, like quite a bit below, which is probably too much. So I'm gonna erase and move that up a little bit. So pulling up, and there we go. So in the original design, I had that just feeding directly into the E. That's another thing where I'm not sure I'm going to keep that. So I'm just bringing this down. Now this might need to be a little more wide, a little over here. If you've noticed, I'm kind of moving my canvas around however works for me. There's a lot of artists who say that you should tape your piece of paper down while you're working because you have the risk of making your lines inconsistent. And that can certainly be good practice, particularly with calligraphy. But with lettering, I'm way more interested in making it easier for myself to create the lines that make the most sense to me. Because I can always go back, straighten it out, look at the big picture and say, ooh, this is working, this isn't working, not really sure what's going on here, etc. Like this, for instance, I'm going to pull the wideness out a little more up here. All right, so back to drawing my next E. So with this design, I know that I'm making it monoline. So monoline means that there is no variation in the width of my letter strokes. So that's one thing that is helpful, as I'm not having to really worry about that. Now, if you were working on something like this, or say you are working on this and you actually want it to have that thick and thin, more calligraphy looking type of thing. So a couple things you could do. For one, you could swap out your pencil for a flat chisel type marker, and that would give you a sort of calligraphic feel. Another thing you could do is get something up, like get something printed, or have something up on your phone as a reference for how the weight would settle on letters like this. And as you're sketching, you can go ahead and add that weight. So I've worked for years on both calligraphy and hand lettering, so with a lot of this stuff I really don't need to look. I just kind of pick where I want such things to be and go for it. One thing you want to keep in mind, it would be a lot more relevant if you were working like with a brush pen or with a paintbrush, is your down strokes are going to be the strokes that are thicker. So let me grab a brush pen here. It has a thin bit and a not so thin bit. So if I were drawing this E with a brush pen, I would start around the apex, push down on my way down, and then lift up as you start going up. So this is kind of garbage looking, but Then I would go back to where my skinny part is, push down, and then be lighter as I go through. So some people draw their E's differently. So what if you were starting at the junction part? So maybe you would go light and then dark. And that works perfectly fine as well. So that would be something to keep in mind if you are sketching like this as well, because you'd want to think about how you're drawing the letter. You could keep this part thin. If you draw your E's the way I do, you would want to make this part thick as well. And then just kind of messily fill that in, because you will fix the messiness later. So if you're working with thicks and thins like that, then you're going to need to pay a lot more attention to your letter spacing. Or if you are planning on the width of your line work being a lot more thick than what I have going on here, then you'll need to make sure you give yourself plenty of space between your letters as well. But I don't anticipate making mine very thick, so keeping this sort of distance is perfectly okay. So I'm going to end this video once I have the bare bones of breathing done. So I'm going to try to kind of quicken things up here, keeping in mind how I wanted my letters to be more curved. So I'm making sure I'm not recreating that weird kind of the shape of my A. I don't have words to define it right now. So I'm trying to keep it round. I'm trying to keep it a similar shape to what my E's are and the bowls of my B and P. So I zoomed out to kind of make sure that I'm keeping the same angle, and it seems that I am. So I'm gonna draw the stem of my A here. Once again, I'm keeping things nice and round, so I want to make sure that the end of this stroke, or what we would say the terminal stroke here, is nice and round as well. So I'm going to pull it up just a little bit so it would be going into the stem of my T. Now, if you notice now, this is another thing as far as keeping your angles the same. If I were to extend these two lines right now, they would eventually meet. So I know that they are not parallel, and I want them to be parallel. So I'm going to erase that a bit and pay a lot closer attention to this line as I draw the other line. So that's perfectly fine now. Pulling down, making sure that I am keeping this nice and rounded as well. And then I'm going over to my H. The original H has this nice, really huge loop. It's, once again, not something I'm sure I want to do. I want to make sure that I have the stem in the way that it would be going, and then my next step in the next video is going to be figuring out how my swashes and loops and such are going to intersect. So I have that. I'm going to add the curve of my H. Bring that up. So it may take you quite a bit longer than it's taking me to get these angles correct. I would like to simply remind you that A, I have been doing this for literally decades, and B, I already have this template set up, so I already have sort of a baseline as to what I'm doing here. I do absolutely, however, recommend getting a dot grid paper of some sort. If you like, you know what, I'll actually include a PDF for you to download so you can print your own sketch paper with a dot grid, so that could make it easier for you if you're trying to follow along here. So creating the bowl of my G here. And I'm already noticing I'm flattening it out more than I want to, so I'm going to pull that out, make sure it's nice and oval, nice and rounded oval. Make it a nice and rounded oval over here as well. And then pulling down my descender. So I'm not gonna do too much in the way of starting to make the rounded bit down there, just a very small start. Then I'm gonna just do a very teeny little cross of my T. So I have things basically the way I want. Now I'm looking closely, some of my angles aren't quite right, but I don't want to make this video any longer than it already is. So I will fix that with our next viewing. And the next video will talk about looking at the shapes of our letters and how we can play with them and push them in different ways to make the entire composition more interesting and more stable. Once again, I will make available a PDF for you guys to download and print off so you can have as many copies of those as you like. If you don't have a printer available, you could probably get them printed at some place like Office Depot or Office Max or Staples and have them deliver them to you. Do not go out to get these printed. I beg of you. Just stay home, trying to help keep you entertained while you're at home and help you learn some new stuff while you're home and potentially have the time. So I will see you in the next couple of days as we move on to the next part of this lettering exercise. Thanks. Love you guys.